By 1944, the skies over Germany had become a graveyard for the Luftwaffe. Allied bomber streams, thousands of planes strong, were systematically erasing German industry from the map, and the traditional piston-engine fighters were simply too slow and too weak to stop the onslaught. The Third Reich needed a miracle, and what they produced was the Messerschmitt Me-163 Komet, a machine so radical, so futuristic, and so fundamentally insane that it felt like it had been dropped into World War II from a different century. It was the world's first and only operational rocket-powered fighter, a tiny, tailless flying wing that looked more like a deadly toy than a weapon of war. But the Komet wasn't just a plane, it was a desperate, high-stakes gamble with the laws of physics. To achieve the impossible speeds required to intercept Allied bombers, German engineers abandoned every safety standard in the book. They built a machine that was essentially a manned missile, powered by a rocket engine that burned a volatile, hypergolic fuel mixture so corrosive it could eat through human flesh in seconds. This wasn't just cutting-edge engineering, it was suicide engineering. To save every possible gram of weight for the massive fuel tanks, they stripped away the landing gear entirely. The Komet would take off from a two-wheeled dolly that dropped away the moment the plane left the ground, leaving the pilot to fly a 600-mile-per-hour rocket that had no way to land except on a single retractable wooden skid. The glitch of the Me-163 started before it even saw combat. It was a weapon that treated its pilots as disposable components. The fuel, a terrifying cocktail of T-Stoff and C-Stoff, was so unstable that a single bump on the runway during takeoff could cause the chemicals to mix prematurely and turn the entire aircraft into a localized supernova. Every time a pilot climbed into that tiny, cramped cockpit, he wasn't just going on a mission, he was sitting on top of a chemical bomb that was actively trying to kill him before he even reached the clouds. The Luftwaffe had created the fastest interceptor the world had ever seen, but in their rush for a miracle, they had built a monster that was just as likely to dissolve its creator as it was to destroy the enemy. When the Me-163 Komet actually managed to leave the runway without vaporizing, it performed a feat of physics that defied everything Allied pilots thought was possible in 1944. While the legendary P-51 Mustangs and B-17 Flying Fortresses struggled to maintain formation at 200 or 300 miles per hour, the Komet would ignite its rocket motor and blast into a near-vertical climb, reaching an altitude of 30,000 feet in under 3 minutes. To the Allied air crews looking down from their bombers, the Komet didn't look like a plane. It looked like a silver streak of lightning rising from the earth. It was the only aircraft in the world capable of exceeding 600 miles per hour in level flight, a speed that essentially broke the tactical glitch of aerial combat. At these velocities, Allied tail gunners found it physically impossible to track the target. By the time they saw the Komet in their sights, it had already zipped through the formation and was miles away. The Komet moved so fast that the German pilots themselves struggled to use their weapons. They would close the distance to a bomber so rapidly that they only had a fraction of a second to pull the trigger before they had to dive to avoid a collision. However, this godlike power came with a catastrophic technical limitation. The rocket engine was a ravenous beast that consumed its entire fuel supply in roughly 7.5 minutes. Once the T-Stoff and C-Stoff were depleted, the roaring rocket motor would suddenly cut out, leaving the cockpit in a haunting, terrifying silence. In an instant, the fastest interceptor in history transformed into a heavy, unpowered glider. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. Without the power to climb or maneuver, the Komet pilot had to maintain enough momentum to glide all the way back to his airfield. Allied pilots soon learned to wait like vultures for the rocket trail to stop. Once the Komet ran out of juice, the American fighters would dive on the helpless, silent glider. The Me-163 was a weapon of extremes. For 7 minutes, it was an untouchable ghost that redefined the speed of sound, and for the next 20 minutes, it was a sitting duck, drifting slowly toward a landing that was often more dangerous than the dogfight itself. It was a masterpiece of aerodynamics that was fundamentally crippled by the very energy source that made it famous, creating a high-speed glitch that the Luftwaffe could never truly solve.
The true horror of the Komet was never found in its dogfights, but in the gruesome aftermath of its landings. Because the aircraft was a tailless glider during its descent, the pilot had to hit a narrow strip of grass at over 100 miles per hour and hope the single underbelly skid didn't snag on a rock. If the landing was even slightly crooked, the remaining drops of the two highly volatile fuels, which were kept in separate tanks, would slosh together. The result was an instantaneous chemical explosion that left nothing but a crater. But for those who survived the impact, a far more terrifying fate often awaited them inside the glass canopy. The T-Stoff fuel was an incredibly concentrated form of hydrogen peroxide, a substance so corrosive that it acted as a universal solvent for organic matter. If a fuel line ruptured during a rough landing, the cockpit would fill with a localized toxic fog. In one of the most chilling documented cases in aviation history, ground crews rushed to a Komet that had performed a successful but bumpy landing, only to find the pilot slumped over the controls. When they opened the pressurized hatch, they didn't find a body. They found that the pilot had been literally dissolved alive. The corrosive fumes had eaten through his flight suit and liquefied his skin and muscle tissue in a matter of minutes, leaving behind nothing but a skeletal remains and a pool of gelatinous sludge. This was the dark reality of Hitler's miracle weapon. It was a machine that required its pilots to wear specialized, non-organic rubber suits just to breathe near it, yet those suits offered almost no protection against a major leak. By the end of the war, the Me-163 Komet had shot down only 16 Allied aircraft, while losing more than twice that number to mechanical glitches and chemical accidents. It stands today as the ultimate example of a weapon that was too advanced for its own good, a 600-mile-per-hour marvel of engineering that was so focused on killing the enemy that it forgot how to keep its own pilot alive. The Komet didn't just break speed records, it broke the sanity of everyone who flew it, proving that some miracles are actually nightmares in disguise.